patriotism just means loving the land in which you live, wanting life to get better for the land or country in which you live.
The United States of America has been a bourgeois settler colonial national oppressor from its very inception, being founded on the genocide and displacement of indigenous peoples and built on the backs of African slave labour.
Patriotism refers specifically to a country, right? That's what it means. That's all patriotism means. That's patriotism. Nationalism is a different concept. Nationalism is loyalty to a nation.
Waving the flags of these powers, both literally and metaphorically, supporting these bourgeois capitalist imperialist states with nationalism rebranded as the friendlier sounding patriotism, can be nothing more than blatant national chauvinism that reinforces the subjugation of the genuinely nationally oppressed peoples of the world.
And that it's really kind of childish to think that you can make up for not really being anti-imperialist in your politics by virtue signaling with this, this kind of teenage rebellion verbiage, which is what a lot of this really is.
So waving the American flag at its core means upholding empire, both in the classical sense of imperialism as well as modern capitalist imperialism.
That's not real politics.
So, Mr. Caleb Maupin is a bit of an interesting character, and I've kind of been putting off talking about him for a long time, because I don't really know a whole lot outside of what other people have told me. So I try not to make any determination about someone until I've done enough research on them myself, and personally, I still don't think that I know enough to make any strong accusations against the person, against the man. But now that I've watched a few videos that he's done, or that his organization has done on his behalf, I've kind of come to the conclusion that he's a weird nerd that kind of dresses like the CEO of a pumpkin patch. From what I've seen so far, it mostly seems like Caleb tries to appeal to right-wing or reactionary talking points by making communism seem a little bit more traditional, I guess. Now, to some of you, you probably think that I'm being overwhelmingly charitable to Caleb, and others probably think that I'm being extremely harsh. So I'm not going to make this into a slap fight or a call-out video. That's really not what I want to do here. Today, I just mainly want to focus on the idea of proletariat patriotism. So, with that being said, let's dive right into this. Oh, by the way, hi, my name's Aaron, this is my show Re-Education. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the arguments on either side about proletariat patriotism, then we're going to jump a little bit into the numbers, then we're going to look at a few quotes from some renowned authors, and then I'm going to give you my opinion on the whole situation at the very end. So if you want to find out if I'm a proletariat patriot or not, then stick around to the end, I guess, or just jump ahead. Who really cares? More likely, you're probably not even going to see this video because YouTube doesn't really show my subscribers any of my videos anymore, so... Okay, so essentially there are two main arguments going on when we're talking about patriotism, specifically within the left or within communism or anarchism. And the first opinion being that Americans or Canadians or other colonialist states can't really be patriotic about their country because their country was built on slavery or genocide or colonialism. A lot of people call the United States not a nation itself, but in fact a prison of nations. Most of these countries were literally built on the enslavement and exploitation of the working class. So a lot of people would look at that and say, you know what, to be proud of something like that probably isn't a good thing. But it is important to note that when a lot of people are talking about this or writing about this, they're not necessarily talking about the land that the country was formed on or the people within it. They're mostly talking about the owning class and the state. And that actually leads into the second argument, the one that Caleb Maupin and Peter Coffin and a lot of other proletariat patriots are trying to make, is that they aren't necessarily saying that they have a blind faith and obedience to their country. They're more or less saying that they have a love for the people within their country and a desire to change things and make things better. That form of patriotism is vastly different from, again, the chauvinistic, jingoistic, imperialistic form of patriotism that most reactionaries and conservatives are pushing. And right out the gate, that's basically where a lot of the arguments end up colliding. because a lot of people are saying patriotism means one thing, and a lot of other people are saying that it means something completely different. Patriotism to a lot of people is commonly thought of just a general love for one's country, or a love for one's community, or the people that live near you, and that sort of thing. Whereas a lot of other people consider patriotism to be a blind faith and obedience to the state and government. So even when anarchist or communist writers are talking about this sort of patriotism, they usually have the caveat being that their version of patriotism is different from the jingoistic, chauvinistic, imperialistic form of patriotism that is essentially instilled into most Americans and Canadians in the modern day. So one side is essentially saying that patriotism is a love for one's countrymen and a desire to make things better, and the other side is saying that patriotism, especially in the United States, is based on jingoism, chauvinism, and all of those terrible things, so therefore we have nothing really to be patriotic about. Now that is interesting, and we're going to unpack both of those arguments a little bit later on. But first we're going to talk a little bit about the numbers and what the general population thinks about the word patriotism. When asked how patriotic would you describe yourself, most Americans, in fact 75% of adults, claimed that they described themselves as very or somewhat patriotic. Of course, this is broken down into several other demographics based on race, religion, and political affiliation, with Republicans being the most patriotic, go figure, at 92%, with black people in general being the least patriotic at 57%. So that means that the majority of Americans in general, about 75% of them, claim to be at least somewhat patriotic. So that must mean that patriotism is good, right? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Of course, what people mean when they're talking about patriotism varies greatly depending on what circles you happen to be circling in. If you're talking to a white Republican, they're going to have a very different idea of what it means to be patriotic than you are if you're going to be talking to a black socialist. The upper class is going to have a different view of patriotism than the lower class, and different people of different backgrounds are all going to view this one specific thing radically differently. It even turns out that a lot of the symbols of patriotism, like the American flag, are actually ranked higher than the government itself in a lot of different situations. For instance, according to the same poll, more people are likely to consider burning an American flag unpatriotic, whereas they consider protesting the government to be patriotic. So it sounds more like people aren't necessarily patriotic in the broadest sense, but it really depends on what they believe and how they feel patriotism applies to them. And I personally think that that's because most people view the idea of patriotism as a symbol of national pride. And when you really sit a regular person down and you ask them what they mean when you say patriotism, do you mean blind obedience to the state and authority, or do you mean national solidarity? Most people would choose solidarity over blind obedience. But that's just the general population's opinion on patriotism and how they would consider themselves to be patriotic. That doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not patriotism is good or bad, or if it's useful or not. It just kind of says that a lot of people believe a certain thing. And that's great to know rhetorically, but that doesn't really say anything philosophically. Most of us know that blind faith and obedience in the state is probably a bad thing, but we do see it all of the time. And even the people who think that blind faith and obedience in the state is a bad thing, a lot of them still end up falling into the blind faith and obedience to the state category. So I actually think that it's an interesting idea to make such a distinction. And Mao Zedong talked exactly about this. Now, one of the quotes that are going around the internet right now about this proletariat patriotism is a snippet from the collective works of Mao Zedong, where he talks specifically about proletariat patriotism and international solidarity between all workers and oppressed people. And I've seen this quote being misrepresented or chopped apart or even having words changed around all over the internet to basically bolster the opinion of whoever happens to be trying to weaponize it at the time. So I'm going to read this quote in full, and then we're going to analyze basically what it means.
Can a communist who is an internationalist at the same time be a patriot? We hold that he not only can be, but also must be. The specific content of patriotism is determined by historical conditions. There is the patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler, and there is our patriotism. Communists must resolutely oppose the patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler. The communists of Japan and Germany are defeatists with regards to the wars being waged by their countries. To bring about the defeat of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler by every possible means is in the interests of the Japanese and German people. And the more complete the defeat, the better. For the wars launched by the Japanese aggressors and Hitler are harming the people at home as well as the people of the world. China's case, however, is different, because she is the victim of aggression. Chinese communists must therefore combine patriotism with internationalism. We are at once internationalists and patriots, and our slogan is fight to defend the motherland against the aggressors. For us, defeatism is a crime, and to strive for victory in the war of resistance is an inescapable duty. For only by fighting in the defense of the motherland can we defeat the aggressors and achieve national liberation. And only by achieving national liberation will it be possible for the proletariat and other working people to achieve their own emancipation. The victory of China and the defeat of the invading imperialists will help the people of other countries. Thus, in wars of national liberation, patriotism is applied internationalism.
And that's from 1937. So clearly Mao laid out how there are two very different forms of patriotism. One of national liberation and one of aggression. So then that brings us to, would Mao actually agree with American patriotism? And I think that really depends. Are we talking about a patriotism that, again, is a blind faith to the state and the oppressive nation? Or are we talking about an international solidarity with all oppressed people? As stated by Mao, these oppressive nations are still harmful to the people that live in those nations, and it's within their best interests to fight against them. But as for what Mao thought of the American government and American patriotism, he had a quote about that exact thing just a little bit further down on the exact same page, where he says, quote,
"The people of the countries in the socialist camp should unite. The people in the countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America should unite. The people of all the continents should unite. All peace-loving countries should unite. And all countries subject to U.S. aggression, control, intervention, or bullying should unite. And so form the broadest united front to oppose the U.S. imperialist policies of aggression and war and to defend world peace."
And that one was from 1964. So clearly making this distinction between the oppressed and the oppressors is a good one. Having proletariat patriotism makes sense if you're talking about a national liberatory movement or an international liberatory movement. But if you're talking about jingoistic patriotism that is blind faith in the state and government, then we clearly have a problem. And I think that this really boils down to how the word patriotism and ideas of patriotism is used. And as far as I can see, the word patriotism boils down to more or less a rhetorical tool. It can be used as a weapon from either side to achieve very different results. Anarchist writer Alexander Berkman even touched on this topic when he talked about patriotism in regards to blind obedience to the state, when he said, quote,
"All they have to do is appeal to your patriotism, flatter you a bit and tell you that you can lick the whole world, and they'll get you ready to don the soldier's uniform and do their bidding. This is what your patriotism, your love for country, is used for. The politicians and the press raise the cry, 'Save your country,' in order to fill you with false patriotism and make you want to fight their battles for them. In the name of patriotism, you are ordered to stop being decent and honest, to cease being yourself, to suspend your own judgment and to give up your life, to become a willless cog in a murderous machine, blindly obeying the order to kill, pillage, and destroy, to give up your father and mother, wife, and child, and all that you love, and proceed to slaughter your fellow men who never did you any harm, who are just as unfortunate and deluded victims of the masters as you are of yours. Only too truly did Carlyle say that patriotism is the refuge of scoundrels."
And this sort of weaponization of patriotism can be seen not just in capitalist countries or bourgeois nations, it can be seen in socialist-led ones as well. In the Soviet Union, at the very beginning, people were told that they were no longer allowed to unionize and fight for better working conditions against the state or against the government, because they were the government. I mean, the government was a representation of the people as a whole, so you can't unionize or strike against the government, because then it would mean that you're striking against yourselves. And you can't strike against yourselves, can you? The problem here is that the ruling classes, whoever's in control, is able to change the narrative and spin things so that whatever they want is considered to be patriotic, and whatever the people want is considered terrorism. And I think that's the point that we have to address when we're talking about patriotism itself. We have to open this up to a much broader conversation and not just boil it down to sloganized ideas like flying the American flag as a communist is a good thing because Mao. Emma Goldman, another famous anarchist, is also quoted in saying things like, "The kind of patriotism we represent is the kind of patriotism which loves America with open eyes." Again, making the distinction between our patriotism and the patriotism of the chauvinists. She goes on in another quote to outline basically the same argument that we're talking about here, when she says,
Thinking men and women of the world over are beginning to realize that patriotism is too narrow and limited a concept to meet the necessities of our time. The centralization of power has brought into being an international feeling of solidarity among the oppressed nations of the world. A solidarity which fears not foreign invasion, because it is bringing all the workers to the point when they will say to their masters, "Go on, do your own killing. We've done it long enough for you."
Concluding with,
"When we have undermined the patriotic lie, we shall have cleared the path for the great structure where all shall be unified into a universal brotherhood, a truly free society."
And personally, I think that this is a fairly accurate representation of how I feel about the situation as well, though I personally do not like calling myself a patriot. Though it might be advantageous rhetorically to use the word patriotism, I usually try to use other words like community, solidarity, and working together with people that you care about. Because at the end of the day, I don't ever see it being really that necessary to latch onto useless buzzwords like patriotism to appeal to someone's jingoistic nature. I don't really think that it's going to be a useful tool, at least for me, to talk about that sort of thing with people. The way I see it, I don't want to be waving an American flag or a Canadian flag. If I have to wave any flag at all, it would be a black flag. The anti-state flag, a flag that represents the abolition of all borders and nations and the unification of all people, and the battle that we may inevitably have to fight to actually win back our freedom and ability to own the things that we produce. I personally think that, like I was saying before, patriotism is a rhetorical tool. It can be weaponized against us or by us. And we have to be able to judge the material conditions and the person that we're talking to determine if such a thing is a good idea or a bad one. If using patriotism is viewed as a tool to get people on our side and to possibly fight for an international proletariat revolution and solidarity, then we have to determine if the person that we're talking to is going to be receptive to those ideas in the first place. Yes, a lot of normies, 75% of them, probably view patriotism to be somewhat of a good thing. And if that's the case, maybe try to work in the conversation that patriotism doesn't just mean blind obedience to one's nation, but it means actively working to make the nation better and working with everyone within that nation to achieve a better society. But at the same time, you can't expect that if you're going to be talking to a marginalized group, that they're going to have the same fawning for American patriotism as you might. Talking about patriotism in those terms is probably going to push them away. Not a lot of black leftists like the idea of waving the American flag. And speaking for myself as an anarcho-communist, I love seeing the damn thing get burned. So it really depends on how you want to form your rhetoric and how you want to move that conversation forward. We should be looking at this as one of the many tools in our toolbox. Sometimes it's very useful, sometimes it's not. It's not very useful to use a hammer when the proper tool is a socket wrench. Just like patriotism isn't always going to be the exact right thing to use. So earlier I brought up the American flag. And I think that the American flag is something that we should probably unpack a little bit as well, because there's a lot of things going on there. When a lot of people see the American flag itself, they aren't really thinking about the history involved within it. And to talk a little bit about that, I'm going to show this clip from my friend American Johnson, who has a really good breakdown of exactly what those stars and stripes actually mean.
The flag itself, look at it. What is it? 13 stripes to represent the 13 original colonies. What were the 13 original colonies? They were mercenary business ventures, embryonic forms of capitalism, certainly colonialism, that exploited indentured servants, indigenous people, human slaves imported from Africa. Everyone that built those colonies was exploited. When those colonies came together to form a union, a United States of America, that entity, who were the people in charge of that operation? White landowning slave owners and white landowning people who were comfortable negotiating with slave owners and working with them and compromising with them, and comfortable with accepting slavery in that union. These were oligarchs. These were plutocrats. These were not heroes. These were monsters. Oh, by the way, not just the 13 stripes of the original colonies, but then the 50 stars, which represent every piece of stolen land, including that the 49th and 50th, which represent, Alaska and Hawaii. Go ask the indigenous people of Alaska or Hawaii if they want to be represented by one of the stars. It's a symbol of colonialism. That's all it is. It's a symbol of subjugation, dominance, colonialism, domination, subjugation, stolen land, genocide. You can't separate it out. You can't filter it out. It's signified in the flag itself, in the design of the flag itself.
The American flag is literally a symbol of genocide, and I don't think that it's useful for us to use those sorts of symbols when we're trying to represent international proletariat solidarity. Personally, I don't think that any flags of any nations should exist at all, and once all of these nations are abolished, once all borders are gotten rid of, every one of these flags should be put on a pyre and burned. The black flags as well. We don't need a symbol of an individual nation. We need a symbol of international solidarity. We may not even need any symbol at all, but I do realize that to the human brain, symbols are important, and it's an easy way for people to see a thing and know the concept that that thing is representing by some sort of symbol. That's why a lot of different governments and people throughout history have used them. Now, there are so many other aspects of this topic that I would love to talk about, but I just don't have the time. Luckily, a lot of other really great YouTubers have made videos on this, and I want to direct you to some of their videos as well, specifically Paul's video on proletariat patriotism, as well as the Second Thought video on patriotism. They're both unbelievably awesome and really in-depth, and they really focus on some important issues. And those are also from a more Marxist perspective. So they're not going to have the exact same outlook as I do on the whole thing, but that's okay. We're allowed to disagree once in a while. And I'll also direct you to the non-compete video about this, also another great resource, and an anarchist who has a very similar opinion as I do on the whole thing. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I think that waving the American flag or saying that you're a patriotic citizen simply is not enough. There has to be a much broader conversation there about the real things that have actually happened and how the country was formed in the first place. There has to be a clear distinction between the chauvinistic versions of patriotism that most reactionaries use and one of solidarity and unity with all of the people within the world who are oppressed. But at the end of the day, not only do I see this as not being enough, I'm not sure if we should use it at all. Patriotism in and of itself, specifically in these oppressor nations, is volatile. Every single media organization, left or right, uses this symbol as a way to brainwash people. Every single person that went to an American or Canadian school has been given a specific amount of information about what these symbols mean and how you should feel about them. And I don't think that we should be in the business of enforcing those narratives. I think that we should be in the business of breaking them down and changing the way people think about society and patriotism and all of those things. If you're going to express your patriotism, then it should be always in a way that shows a love for America with open eyes, as Emma Goldman said. And there may be rhetorical benefits for using that, but patriotism in and of itself is simply a vague term that can be easily confused. If you want international proletariat solidarity, then just say that. That's what you want, then that's what you say. And if you want to fly your American flag, well, you better be talking about exactly what that flag represents and what it really means, what the stars and stripes actually mean. And to be honest, if you can continue to wave that flag after you know what it means, I don't know what to say. Finally, I think that you should probably burn all of your state flags and pick up your black flags. And hopefully one day we can work to get rid of all flags, put them on a pyre, and burn them all. And live in a world of international proletariat solidarity. At least that's the way I look at it. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, keep evolving.